Recently, I found myself playing Bully for the first time. There was a bit of controversy surrounding this game nearing its release, perhaps mostly related to bad press surrounding Rockstar's previous titles. But a name like Bully understandably doesn't help its case either, even forcing Rockstar to change the name in some regions. The game is called Bully, but that isn't really what the game is about. In a meta-narrative sense, you could argue that Bully is an example of what happens when you judge a game by its cover. As the player, you see the world of Bully as Jimmy Hopkins sees it, a rather ugly kid with a chip on his shoulder.
Okay, rich guy. I love it that you're twice as old as my grandfather and you're fat and bald.
That's enough! I've had it with you, you little brat!
While Jimmy is a tough kid, he's not a dishonest one. Not unlike other protagonists in Rockstar games, he's a victim of circumstance. He comes off as childish at first, but it's made abundantly clear in this opening cutscene that Jimmy has no control over his situation. Unwanted by his mother and new stepfather, and left to study at Bulworth Academy after being expelled from many schools before, we discover that Jimmy's chip on his shoulder is well earned.
Mom, why'd you marry that phony? What is wrong with you?
He also doesn't quite fit into any of the cliques, as he neither excels in any particular skill, nor has the family wealth to attain status right off the bat.
Welcome to Bulworth Academy.
Jimmy has a lot to learn, so from a storytelling and gameplay perspective, Bully gets off to a great start. The first day at a new school can be an especially alienating experience. It's likely you won't know anyone, and the daily routine of classes are far from being established. Authority figures are either totally indifferent or actively working against you as well. You might even get into a fight or two. This is the oppressive atmosphere that the developers of Rockstar Vancouver try to achieve in the early moments of Bully. Jimmy narrates the beginning of each chapter to the player, as if the events are happening in the past.
So here I am at probably the worst school in the country, whose alumni are nothing but arms dealers, serial killers, and corporate lawyers. Real scum.
In theory, this might reduce any tension in the narrative, but it actually contributes to Jimmy's point of view, and the game's absurdist tone. Everyone will eventually come to their senses under Jimmy's tutelage. Your scope in Chapter 1 is limited to the school alone, functionally serving as the tutorial. You're able to attend classes to your heart's content, and you obtain most of the items and abilities that help with traversal and combat. Combos, a slingshot, bottle rockets, and a bevy of other tools are available as the story moves along. Getting into fights in the halls of Bulworth is to be expected, so the combat mechanics are where much of the focus of the gameplay lies. You get involved briefly in a couple cliques' early conflicts, specifically the nerds. Your early exploits don't go unnoticed by Gary. Gary's one of the first students you meet at Bulworth and introduces other mechanics to you as Chapter 1 progresses. The introductory chapter is punctuated by Gary's betrayal in the hole. I didn't see it coming, but it made a lot of sense. He did seem to have it in for almost everyone at the school, despite his helpfulness. And his portrayal is far more complex than the other supporting cast. My initial expectation led me to a more antagonistic role from Principal Crabblesnitch and other faculty, but the central conflicts are relegated to other students almost entirely.
Screw you, new kid! This is what we do to teachers' pets around here! You better not!
By now, it should be clear that the writing and direction establishes the caricatures that inhabit the world of Bully. In a story told from the perspective of a teenage boy, nuance is not really a priority. This works on a couple levels. One, in its presentation as a comedy, but also making it clear that we are not dealing with real people, but rather ideas of them.
Anyway, I can't spend my life waiting around for naughty little boys. I've got a man to make happy.
Some of them, however, might come across as insensitive and products of their time. Bully came out when shows like Jackass and other raunchy comedies were at their peak. I prefer a lot more subtlety in my comedy writing myself, but with a game intended for broad appeal, it might be more important that everyone gets the joke.
Are you English? Well, no. I just speak this way because I'm very insecure.
The tone and atmosphere are such a major focus of the game to the degree that the soundtrack at times can seem overbearing. Opting for a purely original soundtrack, Bully is absent of pop songs, which lends to it a timeless quality, as well as further informing the perspective. The twinkling sounds of xylophones akin to a child's toy remind us that Jimmy is still not yet an adult. The music of the opening cutscene, and throughout the game, impresses a kind of topsy-turvy, sinister atmosphere. The minimalist, sophomoric melodies of the guitars come into play once he's at Bulworth, to perhaps invite the player to cause some trouble. When riding a bike into town, the tempo and mood shifts to imply the mischief to come. As the map expands to include the suburbs outside Bulworth, it becomes apparent that the gameplay appeal of Bully doesn't lie with any individual mechanic. For example, there's only so much depth that first-person arcade shooting can provide with the priorities established by the game. Do this kind of mission too many times and it gets stale. However, the gradual combinations of the gameplay mechanics is where the game shines. Combine the aforementioned arcade shooting, put it on rails, and you have yourself a fleshed out mission. Some of the non-essential side missions suffer from not having this same approach, but are still interesting to partake in, because they are more often stories involving the faculty who have their own set of unique problems. But most of the time, there's a surprise after the start of every mission. With the introduction to all this variety comes a caveat. The game begins to show its unpolished nature, especially considering that with the Wii version, the motion controls are not well suited to repetitive inputs that require quick response times. To a degree, you could argue that this aids in the immersive qualities of the gameplay, as the inputs match what's on screen. But the reality is, the human body is only capable of so much. Boxing was made tedious, especially in unlocking the clubhouse when you must defeat a succession of preps in a row. The rhythm minigame in the music class was unnecessarily made more difficult, as my nunchuck would sometimes not register the inputs properly. I also was not sure I would ever be able to finish the Hobo Combo unlock missions because of it. This is likely mitigated on other platforms. My lack of an Xbox really limited my options, and a PC version has its own issues, but I really feel for anyone else who's played the Wii version. Motion controls aside, I felt that stealth and other passive mechanics were not nearly as consistent as the combat, as the tools for stealth are limited to a minimap too small, a camera too close, and only a handful of sound cues.
You do not have permission to be here.
I was most interested in what the social dynamics of the game offered more than any other part, so I made sure I capped out as many class rewards as quickly as possible. The mini-games might insult the average player's intelligence, but they do offer a change of pace from the action-oriented gameplay. Passing the art class does have its, charms.
Let's try not to tell anyone.
Stop one day.
Feel my wrath, peasant.
I'm telling!
But by far my favorite is English. Passing the English exams allowed Jimmy to defuse potential fistfights in the halls.
Right.
This mechanic has its limits in Bully, of course, as Jimmy's grasp of English only provides more varieties of insults, but the inclusion of this social skill turned game mechanic made the experience feel that much closer to realism. The idea being that using words in a tense scenario can introduce empathy in any given situation. By contrast, music and math only provide outfits, which instead might have provided some extra perks in the combat, tools to manage Jimmy's time, or gain status. Going to class, however, is optional. In theory, you could complete the story without attending a single class, provided you don't get caught by the prefects during school hours. The opportunity was missed to have successful combat encounters in the halls influence your status. Rescuing someone from confrontation might be good for roleplay or karma for the player, but there's no extrinsic motivation to do so. I didn't notice any distinction between finishing a fight or running away, so I remained elusive to conflict outside of the missions. You can be punished for engaging in fights that aren't started by you, which seems unfair, but detention as a punishment can be ironically as satisfying as a part-time job. The only difference, of course, being that you cannot earn money. Jimmy's free time can be spent doing various jobs around the town, but the story missions supply enough cash winnings to such a degree that you won't be wanting for anything, therefore not really providing much motivation to engage with them. By the end of the game, you're the richest kid in school without even really trying. The game allows you to manage your time to a degree, but at the sacrifice of the stakes. Compare with a game like Persona 5, where the advancement of time is zero-sum. If you miss out on something that occurs on a specific day, then there's no way to return to it. Save scumming is an option in that game, but that can have its own drawbacks, such as being forced to sit through dialogue again or missing out on other events. Bully faces no such drawbacks, as everything is intended to happen in a straightforward, linear fashion. Like Persona 5, sleeping is forced upon the player, but functionally doesn't serve a purpose outside of making sure the game's systems reset. The only challenge then with mandatory sleep is when missions need to occur at night. You are on more of a time crunch at night, and Jimmy can pass out in the middle of a mission. As Chapter 3 takes place in the winter, I noticed that weekend days and holidays aside from Christmas are excluded. The days operate like clockwork. Once the day begins, there's always going to be 2 classes and some time after to complete missions. Making a predictable schedule like this ensures that the efforts of the developers are experienced in full. But a sense of reprieve and variety from the rigid schedule is totally absent. Furthermore, if you manage to pass a class, there's not a way to plan your day with your free time.
Well done, Jimmy. You've completed all your assignments. If you'd like to come back to work on your skills, you're very welcome.
The lack of a planner in a school setting also seems odd for a game with so much attention to detail. So even if you're allowed to play by your own rules, there's still no way to allow the player to plan ahead. Unless you've memorized the order in which classes happen, you must wait until 9 AM or 1 PM to find out which classes are still available. Chapter 3 and 4 in particular is where Rockstar's signature propensity towards film genre starts to show itself. The Greasers are archetypical of characters you might see in a movie from the 50s, and as a group are wholly distinct in their appearance and interactions. They even have a special soundtrack when getting into fights with them.
Better start running!
They seem out of place in the game setting, but the performances from Johnny and Lola's actors make them seem right at home in the farce that is Bully.
Get off!
Oh, I love it when you get angry, Johnny. I really do. You're so bestial. Hey, Jimmy.
Hey!
Chapter 4 deals with the ongoing feud between the nerds and the jocks, in an obvious homage to Revenge of the Nerds. Considering most of the missions in Chapter 1 focused on helping the nerds, I thought that was the end of things with that group, but the leader of the group insists that the jocks be put in their place.
What are you talking about, you lunatic?
I'm talking about what we're always talking about, amigo. About my favorite dish, revenge!
This chapter is where the comedy and gameplay feel the most cohesive, including a chaotic mission involving harassing the school mascot, and a dancing mechanic that serves to placate the jocks.
Yeah, Bulworth, go, Bulworth!
The full map is utilized by Chapter 5. With this increase in scope, I felt the strain between myself and the game begin to worsen. Starting a mission from a specific location on the map can do a few things to help the player experience. Specifically, reducing load on the hardware, instead only loading animation data when the player activates the mission, and also giving the player control when they can start and stop a mission when they're in the overworld. The linear structure requires missions to advance the story only if you succeed in them, so progress can come to a screeching halt if you have to start a mission over again. This problem is exacerbated in these later chapters, which tend to pad out the missions by including traversal between previously explored areas. Especially when the aforementioned controls and menus are unpolished to a degree that puts players at a disadvantage, or puts players in positions they can't correct for. So I had to ask myself what I felt was better. A prolonged loading screen starting a mission whenever I wanted, making the overworld a non-issue and basically useless, or traversing the map over again to start the mission. A middle ground, I think, would be to utilize checkpoints in missions more often, because failure can spit you back out to a location far removed from the mission starting area. This is far too punishing for a lighthearted game like Bully.
You do not have permission to be here!
The fast travel system is also very limited. Public transit is only available to Bulworth, not from it. On the other side of this, however, missions are relatively short and don't require more than a couple mechanics to be utilized at a time. The main story missions will always be there until you complete them, so players are also free to ignore them to attend classes and complete side content at their discretion. With only a brief appearance in Chapter 2, Gary's presence is less felt by Chapter 5 when the discord he's been sowing comes to full realization. Perhaps this is because Jimmy's focus was entirely on the other groups, that Gary ends up being an afterthought from Jimmy's perspective. This is kind of a shame, as Gary's characterization is so fleshed out and memorable, and such a fascinating foil to Jimmy. It's not in how he looks or sounds, but actually in how much alike he is to Jimmy. Gary and Jimmy are two sides of the same coin, both outsiders at Bulworth, each with their unique issues that don't allow them to fit in. How they choose to navigate their situation is what's different. Gary's own insecurities and lack of trust push him to betray Jimmy, thereby moving Jimmy to counteract Gary's manipulation, pushing the story forward.
But I never did anything to you! You would've if I'd given you the chance!
Bullying is a sensitive subject for many, and for good reason, but the game tries, in a surprisingly sincere fashion, to illustrate through Gary that bullying is a projection, a defense mechanism, often a product of fear, of a lack of control of the world around them, or of other things. Gary's expulsion is justified, but it would have been more satisfying to see some kind of change in Gary's character to suggest that he is not a lost cause. This would have brought the idea home that deception is not a conducive method to accomplish one's goals, while also making him seem a little less pathetic, especially when so much effort went into his characterization. But I digress. In playing the game and defeating Gary, the player as Jimmy learns that true leadership is the way to earn respect. Okay, and maybe just a little bit of muscle.
Well, finally, everything is sorted out, more or less. I mean, I don't want to say we're going to live happily ever after or anything like that, but life is certainly going to get easier.
Rockstar pushed the envelope of what the 6th generation of consoles was capable of. Their reputation for their games preceded them not soon after the release of Grand Theft Auto 3, and then leaning into it further with the release of Vice City and San Andreas. If you saw the Rockstar logo on a box, you understood somewhat what you were getting. A quote-unquote mature adventure game that had a specific emphasis on performance, action, and often over-the-top violence. Action-adventure games were never the same from that point forward, in both how they were made and in what consumers expected from them. So once you've redefined the art of open-world gameplay, where are you to go from there? In 2005, Rockstar announced they would be releasing something that sounded so far removed from GTA, something relatively small in scope and featuring children as the main focus. The change of scenery might be appealing on its own, but what really sets it apart from Rockstar's other titles is in its sincerity and its creative use of its limitations. As you can imagine, bloodshed is not an option in Bully, so the Vancouver studio had a unique challenge in coming up with ways for players to navigate Bulworth and complete missions without killing anyone. Bully is a game that only Rockstar could make, but most importantly, Bully also represents a moment in Rockstar's history where they really sought to surprise their audience, and I think that alone is what makes it worth checking out. In a way, Jimmy Hopkins himself kind of represents this idea, coming to Bulworth to shake things up. Bully is, of course, far from perfect. If I had played the PS2 version first, and then played the Scholarship Edition, I might have felt a bit cheated. New content is fine, but a certain level of polish and fleshing out more of the half-baked ideas would have gone a long way. Whatever version you find yourself playing, Bully stands out as an example of what a publisher and developer can do when they are allowed to play by their own rules, however limiting they may be, to create an experience that tries to say something while feeling honest and familiar. If you made it this far, I'd like to thank you for watching and supporting my channel. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already, and enable notifications to be sure you don't miss the next video. I've got more ideas for videos planned, so I hope to see you then. And of course, let me know what you think about the video and the game. Really, any sort of interaction that I see on my channel is really motivating for me, and I actually like reading and replying to everyone's comments. If you also have the time, check out the links in the description so you can see what I'm up to. Thanks again, and I hope to gain your further support. Take care.
I really would like a romantic present.
You like them?
Why are boys so confused?
Oh, you really do like me. It's like we're Romeo and
closer,
Juliet,
please.
don't you think? I don't think anyone's ever made me feel that way before.